This morning, we were exceedingly proud to host Jodie Segal, hi Jodie, and Kelsey Hoeper, and I'm going to probably say Hepner once in a while, people here will understand why, is an amazing organization that provides resources to help prevent teen suicide. Being a middle school teacher, I've had a few kids that we've lost. The organization, founded but only a dozen years ago, has helped to educate over 300,000 students. They're doing better than the humanists. I will let Jodie and Kelsey tell you about Alyssa's mission and teen suicide prevention in a minute. But first, let me tell you a little bit about these talented and dedicated young women. As Alyssa's missions, that's tough. As Alyssa's missions director of education, Jodie collaborates with schools, agencies, and religious institutions in order to raise awareness and provoke dialogue about teenage suicide among teens, staff, and parents. Her primary task is assisting area-wide middle and high schools to implement the SOS Signs of Suicide Prevention Program, an evidence-based program that teaches students how to recognize the warning signs of suicide and seek out needed help from a trusted adult. In addition to providing hands-on support to those staff members implementing SOS, Jodie further facilitates all staff training sessions as well as presentations for parents in order to help these groups identify and support at-risk youth. Jodie is no stranger to preventing efforts or working with kids in schools and families. She began her career as a school social worker, where she implemented a wide range of programs designed to foster resiliency in students and strengthen their support system. Prior to joining Alyssa's mission, Jodie spent 6 years as an assistant principal at both the elementary and middle school level. She's a solid awareness of issues and pressures affecting today's youth, and like Alyssa's mission, recognizes the need to work collaboratively in order to build a safer community. Jodie has a BA degree from Washington U in St. Louis, my alma mater, and a master's degree in social worker from the University of Wisconsin, my daughter's alma mater. She completed a school administration degree at Loyola University, none of our alma maters. Kelsey is a suicide, Kelsey, raise your hand, Kelsey, is a suicide prevention educator at Alyssa's mission. She started volunteering for the mission in early 2016, happily joined the team in the fall of 2017. Kelsey assists in the expansion of the SOS Suicide Program and the Everybody Matters program aimed at promoting identity, development, and resilience among youth. She has a bachelor's degree from Lake Forest College and is in the final stages of completing a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling from Roosevelt University. She completed her certification as a grief support specialist from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2018. And now, I give you Jodie and Kelsey, two talented, bright, hardworking, really dedicated, good young people.
Thank you. Wow. Thanks so much, Matt. I'm going to stand here, if that's okay. I have a hard time standing behind a podium. But as you just heard, I'm Director of Education for Alyssa's Mission. We are a nonprofit organization. We're based in Northbrook, so not too far from here. Our whole focus is suicide prevention, specifically suicide prevention in middle and high schools. We got started, unfortunately, because of a suicide. The young woman you see in the photo there, Elyssa Myers, lost her life to suicide in 2004 when she was just 16 years old. So when you look at Alyssa, you can see she was a really pretty girl. She had a lot going for her. She came from a good home. She was a good student. She had a lot of friends. She was a great athlete, played basketball for the high school team at New Trier, was a wonderful writer. You can read some of her poetry on our website. But Alyssa also had depression, and as you may already know, depression's much more than just feeling really sad. It's a serious illness that affects all parts of someone's life, and in some cases can even lead to thoughts of suicide. So that's why it's so critical that we talk about it. When Alyssa was in school, people were afraid to talk about suicide. They thought if you talked about it, it would somehow put the idea in someone's head. And we know now that's a myth and that school communities need to talk about it. So that's ultimately what prompted Alyssa's parents to start Alyssa's Mission shortly after her death. What we do is we fund and we help schools implement an evidence-based, nationally recognized suicide prevention program called SOS Signs of Suicide Prevention Program. It was developed by an organization in Massachusetts taught all over the United States, and we work with schools in Illinois to help them get this program up and running. We fund the program in its entirety, and then we also support schools with all phases of implementation. We currently partner with over 200 schools, and that's a lot for us because here today are 2/3 of our staff, so we're small but mighty, and we really pretty much are spending all of our time out in schools. I'll tell you a little bit more about SOS in just a minute, but I want to first start with a video. This video clip of Alyssa actually comes from the high school SOS program. And I know I just mentioned this is a program that we did not develop. It's a national program. But we work really closely with the organization in Massachusetts that did develop this program. We're the only organization in Illinois that's directly bringing this program out to schools and supporting schools with implementation. So when Screening for Mental Health updated the high school video, which is a big part of the SOS program, they asked Alyssa's family if they'd be willing to share her story. So that's how Alyssa's story is part of this national program. So it obviously makes it very personal to us when we're out in schools and bringing this program to students, teaching this program, to have her story be shared. I wanted to share just to provide a little more context for why we do the work that we do, and then you can also hear some of the risk factors and warning signs for both depression and suicide that Kelsey is going to be talking about later in the presentation.
Very energetic, lots of times happy child that really enjoyed life.
She was a bright, beautiful girl who was full of life. She had 2 younger siblings that looked up to her and adored her, 2 loving parents. She walked into a room and she really lit up the whole room. She had an unbelievable personality. There were a lot of good things in Alyssa's life, but Alyssa also experienced a lot of hardships in the short period of time that she was here. She endured a lot for somebody so young.
When Alyssa was in 5th or 6th grade, she was raped by one of her family friends. And, you know, I think that was a definite turning point in her life. For the next few years, it was kind of a downward slope.
She was bullied a lot, and she struggled with her self-esteem, and she cared a lot about what others thought, and she got down easily when people weren't nice. And I just think as time went on, she couldn't take it. It was built up year after year after year.
Kids can be mean and cruel and terrible people, and you know, maybe it was just a snowball effect that everyone just started harassing her.
There were warning signs prior to her being diagnosed with depression. She acted out. She had a lot of anger in her to the point where it was just not normal behavior. You know, making poor decisions and choices, compromising herself and her safety. And all of these were warning signs.
She was clearly depressed and down, and she was sad a lot of crying.
I'll never forget this. When I walked into the door of her English classroom, the teacher had all the writings up on the wall, and Alyssa had the title of her paper was, "My Life Makes Me Want to Cry." So these were all warning signs.
In 7th grade, Alyssa would verbalize to me that she wanted to end her life, and she would show me the cuts on her wrists and would, you know, ask me if I would attend her funeral if she did kill herself.
She would say, "I want to kill myself. I just want this to be over."
Things like that. We were so young, and I had never heard anyone talk like that before, and obviously I took it seriously, but I was young enough that, you know, it was hard to know what to do and what to say to her and who to talk to.
When I first heard about Alyssa, the principal said that she passed. I knew immediately that she had committed suicide. It's so difficult to cope with it since your friend taking her own life because you're left beating yourself up.
Looking back, I do not think I took the situation serious enough.
Maybe I didn't take it seriously enough. I mean, I guess I obviously didn't if she's gone.
I wish that I had taken Alyssa to someone I trusted and shared with them what she had told me and not kept it inside.
So I've seen this clip probably hundreds and hundreds of times. I work, when I'm not out at a school, I'm typically in the office where Alyssa's mom is. This has now become her life's work. So we know how much a suicide can affect a family, and just hearing, especially from Alyssa's friends, I think that's the message that I always take most from this video clip, the fact that they didn't know what to do. You know, they didn't have the education. They wanted to be there to help their friend, and they didn't know how to help. So this is why it's so important that we're getting this education out there, especially to teenagers. They're really typically the first ones to be aware of signs because friends confide in other friends, and that's really the basis behind SOS. But you know, we all know suicide is a concern. I just want to share a few statistics, just to provide some context for what we're talking about. Suicide's the second leading cause of death among young people ages 10 to 34, with about 5,900 youth lives lost to suicide each year in the United States. Suicide is also underreported. So many so-called accidents are really, in fact, suicides. And then for every completed suicide, it's estimated that there are at least 45 attempts with an additional 250 people who are seriously thinking about suicide. And, you know, really, these are an underestimate. These numbers, I've seen the statistics even higher than this. So when you're factoring those last two items into the mix, youth suicide's an even bigger concern than what the statistics reveal. But there is hope. 4 out of 5 people reveal clear warning signs prior to a suicide attempt. So that's why it's so important that we're educating really everybody, but you know, especially teenagers, parents, teachers, community members, people who have daily contact with teens about these signs so that they know what to do if they're observing them in someone they know. So we heard from the video clip some of the risk factors that were present with Alyssa. She had depression, she was bullied, she was sexually assaulted. These are definitely things that can heighten one's risk for suicide. In the general population, mental illness is the leading risk factor for suicide. In youth, the 3 most significant risk factors are depression, substance abuse, and previous suicide attempts. This next statistic is really noteworthy. 90% of people who die by suicide have a mental health condition at the time of their death, most commonly depression, and it's typically depression that is not diagnosed and or not being treated. So logic speaks to the fact that if you want to help prevent suicide, you want to identify those people who have depression and get them linked to treatment and services as early and proactively as possible. So we want to be educating. That's an important step in terms of identification. But the question becomes, is it safe? Is it okay to be talking about suicide? This is a really difficult subject area, and especially if we're going to be talking about it with our youth, is it safe? So the myth is that if you talk about suicide, you're going to somehow, again, I mentioned this earlier, somehow put the idea in someone's head. We know now that that is not true, and it's actually very helpful to be having these conversations. If someone is already having thoughts of suicide, we are not going to plant the seed by talking about it. And in fact, it's going to let them know that this is an okay thing to talk about, that help is in fact out there. And for people who aren't having these thoughts, we're empowering them. We're giving them the tools they need to know what the signs are, and then also what to do if they're observing signs in themselves or someone else. So in terms of the SOS program, why did Alyssa's mission choose to endorse this particular program? Why is this the program that we're bringing out there to schools? And really, you know, SOS is a comprehensive program. It has all the components needed in terms of helping to prevent suicide. There's education for students, there's education for staff, there's education for parents. There's a screening piece in order to help identify students teens who might possibly be at risk in the moment. So it really had all of the elements needed. And then on top of that, the program does what it's intended to do, which is help reduce suicide attempts. Original research that was conducted around this program showed a 40% reduction in self-reported suicide attempts for students who had been through this program 3 months later. And replication studies that were done just in the last couple of years showed a reduction as high as 64%. And SOS is the only school-based program shown to actually reduce attempts. So that is really, really key. The program has been vetted, you know, it's been looked at in terms of making sure the messaging is safe for students. On top of that, the program is shown to yield increased knowledge about depression and suicide, as well as more adaptive attitudes about help seeking. The program entails, there's a separate middle and high school program. So, you know, one set of videos geared for students ages 6th through 8th grade, and then also a high school program. And you already saw one clip that comes from that high school video. So the main component of the program is a video and a discussion. Just a 20-minute video for middle school, 23 for high school. It's something that can be taught in one class period, which schools really like. Along with the video, there's a discussion surrounding it. And then I mentioned the screener. So students fill out a brief 7-question screener. It does not diagnose depression or suicidality. It's informational. So it lets school staff, school mental health staff, become aware of those teens who might possibly be at risk for depression and or suicidal behavior. So it's really geared to alert staff to students who might need further attention. As part of that brief screener, students also have an opportunity to indicate if they want to talk to an adult about themselves or a friend. So this is really important. The screener, you know, it's going to identify the student themselves, but they might say no to all the questions, yet they have really a high concern about someone else. So because of this dual way of tapping into students who are at risk, we can really identify students who might need some support. There's accompanying materials that go along with the program to really reinforce the messaging. So there's newsletters, there's ACT wallet cards, posters. ACT, by the way, and I'm going to talk about this next, but it stands for Acknowledge, Care, and Tell. So this is the message that students are taught in both the middle and high school programs. We want them to know that it's okay to be acknowledging these signs, that they're serious. If it's a friend showing these signs, show the friend they care, and then telling a trusted adult. So this is really kind of the cornerstone of the program, again, both at the middle and high school level. We're really making students aware of the fact that their job is not to be their friend's counselor. Their job is not to fix the problem, that depression, if that in fact is what it is an illness. It's an illness requiring treatment. They cannot fix it. It requires support from a medical professional. So the best way they can help their friend is to get a trusted adult involved. And we always have ample discussions with students in the classroom about who those trusted adults are, who they can go to at school, who they can go to out in the community and at home. So I'm going to show you this next clip. This comes from the high school SOS Signs of Suicide program. So you already saw one of the real stories. The high school program has 3 real stories, Alyssas, and then 2 survivor stories, and then 4 scenarios like the one you're going to see. The middle school program is different in that it does not have any real stories, and the scenarios are geared towards a that middle school age level. The middle school program also has an interview with a counselor where the narrator of the video, a high school student, is asking the counselor different questions about, for example, the differences between feeling sad and being depressed, self-injury, what they should do if they see something online. So it's really kind of geared more to that appropriate age level.
Hey. Oh, it looks like I'm screwed. So much for college. What are you talking about? It can't be that bad. Well, you know what? It's only a test, you know. That's it. All it is. What are you doing? You don't drink like this. What's going on? It's really not that bad. You were doing so well, and you have all your extracurriculars.
Look, you don't get it.
All right, everyone in my family went to college, good colleges, and they all got scholarships. And if I don't get one, then I'd be better off dead.
Oh, come on. How can you say that? What are you talking about? Everybody's so proud of you. You're just like the smartest guy I know.
Exactly, which is why everyone expects me to be the best at everything I do. Yeah. I'm such a loser if I don't get into a good school. Nothing else matters. I can't face everybody.
Give me a break. Give yourself a break. I would do anything to have your brains.
Whatever. I am so tired of always trying to keep it together and be the best. Family would be better off without me.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. Better off without you? Okay, we gotta talk to someone. Your mom or sister.
No. They would never understand. You have to promise me you won't tell anybody. Come on.
I promise. That's what friends are for. But I gotta go to practice, all right? I gotta go.
I'll see you later.
This is really serious. I shouldn't have promised to keep it a secret.
Whatever. Whatever, you know, I'm so tired of always trying to be the best and keep it together. My family would be better off without me.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. Better off without you? Okay, we gotta talk to someone.
Like who, my mom and my dad? They'd never understand. Now, promise me you won't tell anybody about this.
No, I can't promise you that. It's not going to happen. You need to talk to someone about this. Maybe your older sister, Beth.
I'm not sure, man.
I am. Come on, let's go. Yeah.
So the scenarios are really pretty similar between the middle and high school programs in that they first show someone demonstrating not the best way of responding, and then they replay the end of the scenario where the friend, or in some cases it's a sibling, actually applies that ACT help-seeking message. So we're really reinforcing that throughout, and of course focusing on the positives and what the student did right that second time around. In terms of SOS and the impact that it has, we know that this program does what it's supposed to do. So this is now my 8th year working for Alyssa's mission, and we collect data each and every year from all of our school partners. So they fill out a survey, one person from the school, and that really deals with the number of students who are educated through this program and ultimately referred on for some kind of service or support. So we have found that on average, and this is true at both the middle and high school level, about 13% of those teens who go through the program are identified as being in need of an interview. And this is because of how they are filling out that screening form, which also has that exit slip component where they have the opportunity to indicate if they want to talk. So because of that, about 13% are interviewed, and this is typically by school social workers, counselors, psychologists. Schools also will partner with agencies, and sometimes Alyssa's mission will assist to link them with outside support in the event they need extra hands on deck in order to be following up with students. And really, they're getting more information during these interviews. So it's a school. They're not diagnosing students at that point either. But it is important to collect more information and try to determine what support, if any, a given student needs, whether it's support at the school level, maybe checking in with the counselor, seeing the social worker, being part of a group. Maybe they need an assessment in the community to determine if they need some counseling. And we unfortunately, or I guess fortunately too, are almost always identifying students who require hospitalization. And this is, I know, a scary thing for schools, but when we have schools identify students who previously were not even on their radar, and these are students who had an active suicide plan and really need imminent support, this program really can be very, very powerful. I didn't mention this, about half of the students who are interviewed are ultimately referred on, This includes students the school already knew about. So certainly when they're identifying students, they're going to already be aware of many students who already are getting social work support, students who perhaps had a suicide attempt in the recent past, students who have a diagnosis of anxiety or depression. So those students will pop up as a result of the screener, but we always, pretty much without fail, are identifying or hearing that schools are identifying students that they were unaware of previously. And just in terms of our data from this past school year, we educated almost 43,000 students in suicide prevention in 2017-18. And on top of that, about 2,700 were identified as needing some kind of support, either at the school level or in the community. And in terms, I just mentioned students who were previously on schools' radars and students that are newly identified. This has happened, and again, this is my 8th year, so I've collected data every year. It's almost always like somewhere around 62-63% of students who are referred on for either brand new services or services that are at a higher level than what they were previously getting. So again, this is really, really important what we're helping schools to do through this program. Last school year, 721 students were referred on for vital counseling services, and 74 were hospitalized because they were at imminent risk of suicide. So again, we know this program really is saving lives. And in terms of the impact, we have so many stories. It's hard to share them all. I'm going to throw a couple on the screen. I'm not going to read them to you, but you can kind of look as I talk. But I want to just share one that has always stuck with me. My first year working with Alyssa's mission, we partner with, there's a school in Oak Lawn that we work with, and the social worker reported that a boy came forward because of the screener. So she was meeting with him and trying to get more information, and he was very, very agitated as she was having this interview. And he just kept repeating, I just don't understand why you're doing this program today. Why are you doing this today? And she was trying just to ask him some questions and try to figure out what was going on. Well, ultimately, he ended up pulling a suicide note out of his pocket because he was planning that day to go home and take his life. So, it's really, really powerful. Kelsey and I were actually at a school a few weeks ago, middle school, and there was an 8th grade boy who came up to us after the program, and he said, the video we just watched, those symptoms there, that's kind of how I feel. And I asked him if he indicated on his survey if he wanted to talk to someone, and he said, yes, I did. And I said, good. I said, the social worker is going to be pulling you out of class today, so talk to her about these feelings, and we can see if she can get you some help. I asked his name, James, just to make sure that he didn't get missed. And immediately after the program, we talked to the social worker and asked her about him, and she said, oh, James, he's new to the school. This is his second week here, and very nice boy. I don't know a lot about him. We pulled out his screener. He had said yes to every single question, including 2 questions dealing specifically with suicide, asking him if he thinks seriously about killing himself and if he's tried to kill himself in the past year. He said yes to both. When she ended up meeting with him and getting more information, it was ultimately determined that he was at very high risk. He ended up being hospitalized, and when I followed up with the social worker a week later, he was still in the hospital. So this program enabled him to get the help that he needed, which is really, really important. I can't read backwards, but there was another student, and you guys can read, but this comes from one of our schools as well, someone at high risk. And the thing that sticks out with me, and we've heard stories like this before, students ask questions like, during this follow-up interview, where do you see yourself in high school, or anything about their future, and students to say, oh, I didn't think I'd be alive then. I mean, it's a scary, scary thing. Some of these students, these kids, they don't know what it is that they're feeling, these signs of depression, these thoughts that they're having, and they keep them to themselves and they don't share them with anybody. And then to finally understand, oh, this is what it is. It's depression. Well, that's normal, and that's, it affects a lot of people, and there's help and there's treatment. So it kind of opens up their eyes to the fact that something can be done, which is really significant. Another one, just again, another example of how someone is coming forward because of the screener, and then also how other students are coming forward to report concerns about someone else, which is really, really important. The ACT message that students are learning through this program, they not only are identifying students that they're concerned about the day of the program, but throughout the school year and beyond. So this is something that enables other at-risk teens to get identified, not just on SOS program days, but really throughout the school year. This example happened just a month or so ago at one of our high schools, and it again speaks to how powerful that ACT messaging is. There was a student who came forward because of the program. She was concerned about her half-brother who lived in a different state. And he had been talking about self-injury, and he had also made some vague comments that led her to believe he might be thinking about suicide. She wasn't sure where he went to school. She knew he was in Texas, but they were able to identify the boys' school, and the social worker at this student's school called that other school. They were able to pull this half-brother down and ultimately get him the help that he needed. So this program, again, not just identifies students themselves, but also students are able to refer on others that they have concerns about. In terms of what we do and how we work with schools, really our focus is to be hands-on with schools, especially those first couple years that we work with them. We really are there for every step of the way. We're meeting with schools to plan for the program to make sure it's successful. We're there to train staff, so we do an all-staff training, all the teachers in the building, training them on warning signs, training them on risk factors, training them on what they can do if someone comes to them to disclose concerns, and making sure they're aware of the protocols at their school. What happens if someone comes to the math teacher? We want that math teacher to know they shouldn't leave that other student alone. They shouldn't send them back to class and send an email to the social worker. It's really, really important that everyone has training. We're there at the schools on the program day and supporting them. We're often teaching the program, or one of the facilitators teaching the program. We collect data, so we do pre and post testing that first year that we work with a school in order to make sure that students are learning. And I already mentioned the follow-up outcome data that we collect regarding students who are identified and referred on for services through that screener. So year one and year two, we are there as much as schools need us, but our goal is that we're training schools to take this program on independently. We work with, I mentioned already, we're up to 200 schools or maybe beyond. We've already taken on about 35 to 40 new schools this year alone, which is the most that we have ever done. So we are growing exponentially. More and more schools are reaching out to us, and we've never turned anyone away. So the only way we can continue to grow is if we are training our schools to be able to sustain this program. Some of our schools need support every year. They just don't have the needed support at the school, and we will go there and help them. But most of our schools do have the resources in place where they can, and very successfully, can keep this program up and running. But we buy materials for our schools each and every year that they need it. Schools never pay anything, and that includes all of the support that we're offering as well. In terms of what we ask from our school partners, very, very little in my opinion, considering all the time and everything that we're giving them. We really want them to be maintaining the integrity of the program, using the video, having discussion. Students are filling out the screener. Those are the core components, and we want to make sure that they're utilizing those core components in the correct way. On top of that, protocols I already mentioned briefly. It's more for their safety. We don't want schools to have an incident where they, for example, aren't notifying parents, and then something happens, and then the school could then be liable. It's really, really important to us that we're training our schools in terms of having these needed protocols in place, making sure they're communicating with parents effectively on the program day or during any situation where they identify someone who might be at risk for suicide. We want them to have a good assessment procedure in place for what they should do and how they should follow up with the student reporting thoughts of suicide. And I mentioned training all the teachers as well. On top of that, I mentioned pre and post testing. That's just year one. We have seen really strong growth in terms of students increasing knowledge. We have, I think, yet to have a school who has not met our post-test benchmarks. So we're really, really proud of the way that our schools are taking this program on, and the fact that students are internalizing this information and learning it and really kind of taking it in. And then lastly, each and every year, a school is asked to fill out that survey. So it's a quick online survey in order for us to see outcomes. In terms of how we fund this program, we are funded because of grants and donations. So for us to be able to pay for this and continue to support our schools with this program, we need data. So that is why we collect this. It's really, really important to us. And we also want to know that the program is continuing to have such an important impact. So I mentioned earlier briefly some risk factors, warning signs. Whenever we're out in the community, anywhere talking to people, it's really important to us, if we're telling about our work, we also are using this opportunity to educate people about risk factors, warning signs, what they can do. We know all of you are in a position to be gatekeepers as well, whether it's looking out for children, for parents, for other family members, colleagues, friends, acquaintances. We all can play a part in terms of helping to prevent suicide. So with that, I'm going to introduce or have Kelsey come up, and she's going to kind of finish up with some education.
Okay, so we'll start. I want to briefly address some of the leading risk factors for suicide. And whenever there is a suicide, typically the first question that suicide loss survivors ask themselves is why? Why did this happen? Why did this person do this? And when the media and news outlets decide to report on a suicide, very often they will point to just one specific factor, either that the student was bullied for identifying as gay, or a high school senior just lost a major scholarship to the school of his dreams. But rarely, if ever, is there just one cause or one reason. So when we're asking the question, what causes suicide? In the majority of cases, suicide is the result of a combination of risk factors in the presence of one or more negative life events. And a risk factor is any personality trait or environmental trait that is associated with suicide, although they may not be direct causes. I know that this font is a little bit on the smaller side, but Jodie and I put together a handout, and this chart will be on that handout, so you can refer to it later. As Jodie mentioned, under the behavioral health section, depression, substance misuse, and previous suicide attempts are currently the leading risk factors for suicide among young people. I do also want to highlight what is called non-suicidal self-injury disorder. This is self-harm, typically manifested as intentional cutting or burning of oneself, meaning that someone is purposely hurting themselves. Individuals who engage in this impulsive behavior are not necessarily looking to kill themselves. They don't necessarily have a desire to die, but they are trying to deal with really intense emotions, a lot of emotional pain, whether that be shame, guilt, fear, sadness. Obviously, this is an ineffective and unhealthy coping tool and could potentially lead to accidental suicides down the line. So when we're in middle schools and high schools, we encourage students to be on the lookout for this type of behavior, whether that be cuts on the wrist, someone who's wearing clothes to kind of cover up their arms or their legs, stuff along that nature. Under environmental, I have to do opposite, in the right-hand corner here, I do want to identify a few here. The first is access to lethal means. Firearms are used in over half of all suicides in the United States, and they are the most lethal. Firearms in the home increase the risk for suicide, whether somebody has a mental health disorder or not. And When we're in schools, we're talking with parents, staff members. If a student is experiencing a mental health crisis, we encourage parents to remove firearms ammunition from the home, either temporarily or long-term. And lack of acceptance, specifically pointing to LGBTQ plus issues. So teenagers who identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide in comparison to their straight or heterosexual peers. And this doesn't have to do with the fact that they identify in a certain way. It has to do with the harmful rhetoric that they're hearing from the media, from the peers, sometimes, unfortunately, from their own family members. And when these students come out to their family members and their friends, and they're not accepted, they're rejected, they are 8 times more likely to attempt suicide in comparison to LGBTQ plus teens that come from accepting or low rejecting families. So as parents, as individuals who work with young people, if you suspect your child or even your child's friend is struggling, maybe they identify as LGBTQ plus, maybe they're grappling with their own sexual identity, their own gender identity, the more supportive and communicative that you are, the better, especially if there's other risk factors that are in place. And these next 2 slides are dedicated to the critical signs of suicide, as Jodie had mentioned a couple times throughout the presentation. And the things that will be listed here only need to happen once to demand your immediate attention and your immediate action. The first is talking or writing about suicide or death. This is actually the #1 warning sign. And of course, that can be verbal, face-to-face conversation. But that also includes suicidal threats that come to you or you hear about through text message, email, a Facebook post, something scribbled on a Post-it. All of this counts. And when it comes to teenagers specifically, we always want to take these suicidal threats extremely seriously. If somebody is talking about suicide, that means that they've been thinking about it probably for a significant amount of time. We never want to assume that that child is just joking or being dramatic or blowing off steam or attention seeking. We always want to take these extremely seriously. And kind of along those lines are direct or indirect statements about suicide. A direct statement about suicide might be something along the lines of, I want to die. I wish I were dead. While an indirect statement could be something along the lines of, you don't have to worry about me too much longer. My family and my friends, they would be better off without me. Dropping out of school and or activities, especially if these activities were much loved by that student, and they drop out of these activities for really no apparent reason. As Jodie mentioned, Alyssa was a pretty involved young woman. She was a star basketball player, she was creative, she had a lot of friends, but when Alyssa became depressed, she quit the basketball team for, again, no outward apparent reason. Isolation. An individual who is purposefully cutting themselves off, cutting off communication ties with family and friends, whether that means that they're starting to seclude themselves in their room. Uncharacteristic risk-taking behavior. And this might look like a student who is suddenly getting into fights. They're getting in cars with people who had been drinking. They're shoplifting. Basically, they are putting themselves in harm's way on purpose. Neglecting appearance or hygiene. And for a young person, this might look a little bit differently. But for, let's say, a young lady, and you know that she's somebody that always put on makeup. She always brushed her hair, but then you notice that she has stopped putting on makeup. She is no longer brushing her hair. Might also look like an individual who has stopped showering, or they're wearing the same outfit again and again. And obtaining any sort of a weapon or means for self-harm, and giving away prized possessions. We know that young people don't have wills in the same way that adults do, and their way of tying up loose ends is giving away things that mean a lot to them. In the days, weeks before Alyssa died, she started to give away her clothes, her jewelry. That might also look like a student who gives away the passwords to their phone, to their laptop, to their desktop. And sudden and unexplained improvement in mood, especially in an individual who has been depressed or at a very low mood for a significant amount of time. And it's our natural inclination to read this and think to ourselves, well, that's a good thing, right? We want them to feel better. And it's our natural inclination to look at our friend or a child who's been depressed, and then you notice that they're smiling, they're jumping up and down, they're high-fiving their friends, and you think to yourself, thank goodness, I don't have to worry about this person anymore. When in fact, it could mean really just the opposite. I will say that people who contemplate suicide, in the majority of cases, don't necessarily want to die, but they have such a perceived, insurmountable psychological pain that they are dealing with that they're looking for an escape, they're looking for relief. And when an individual makes the decision to end their life, they have a plan in place, they can feel an overwhelming sense of calm and relief. It can also look like joy. It can look like euphoria. It can look like someone having like just boundless energy. Of course, the takeaway point with this warning sign is that we want to be identifying students way before it ever gets to this point. And this next slide, great, excellent, are the critical suicide signs for adults. As we're going through this, you will notice that many of the warning signs are very similar. There's a lot of similarities, but of course there are a couple of differences, and I'll highlight just a few of them. Of course, talking and writing about death, indirect direct statements, and suddenly quitting a job, again, for really no apparent reason. Isolation, uncharacteristic risk-taking, which might include such things as breaking the law, increased use of alcohol or drugs, including prescription medication, and an individual, an adult, who outwardly just is really stopped taking care of themselves. They're perhaps ignoring medical advice given to them by their primary physician or their psychiatrist. It can also look like an adult who purchases a firearm, or you're noticing that they're saving or stockpiling medication. Giving away prized possessions. And that might also look like someone who suddenly is reworking what's written in their will, or they're hurriedly putting together final arrangements and tying up loose ends. And again, sudden and unexplained improvement in mood. And then where to get help, because I'm sure this is all on all of your minds. I'm sure there are many, many parents in this room. You have a child in your life. For non-emergency situations, we recommend getting in touch with your child's pediatrician, or also getting in touch with the school social worker, the school counselor. This is a great first place to start. This also includes having conversations with trusted friends, with relatives, with religious leaders in your life. Getting second opinions, saying, hey, I'm noticing these signs in my child. Are you noticing these signs as well? And then on the bottom here is the number for the suicide prevention hotline. And parents, you can always call this number. And when you call this number, a crisis counselor will always be on the other end to talk with you and to help you identify services for your child within your area. And you can call this number anytime. It's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And another question that tends to be on the minds of parents is, when is it an appropriate time for me to link services up for my child? And the best way to answer that question is that it is time to seek help and professional assistance when you're noticing that these changes in your child's mood and behavior are having an impact on their ability to function. Whether that be depression, it could be an indication of depression, or perhaps another mental health disorder. But I will say that your child does not have to be clinically depressed or have any other diagnosable mental health disorder, for that matter, to warrant mental health treatment. And then in emergency situations, if it is an emergency, meaning that the child has expressed an intent to die, they have access to means, they have a specific plan in place, that you want to place a call to 911 or take them to the nearest emergency room. Secondly, if a child does make an attempt, again, you want to take them to the nearest emergency room for medical attention. If the student or the child is not actively suicidal, and what that might mean is maybe they don't have a specific plan in mind. It's not imminent at this moment. Very, very scary emergency situation, but perhaps they're a little bit unclear in how they would plan to follow through. We recommend taking them to the nearest behavioral health hospital for a couple of reasons listed here. In a traditional ER, the wait time can be up to 8 hours. And in a behavioral health hospital, the wait time is usually much less. And secondly, not every hospital has a psychiatric facility. So there's a possibility that if you take your child to a traditional hospital, they'll eventually just be transferred. And these are just a couple, certainly not exhaustive list, of local inpatient and partial hospitalization programs within the Chicago area and the suburbs in which we are now. And on our website, we have wonderful resources for students, for parents, for schools. And that list that was just on there, that list is on our website as well. So please, take a look at our website. And again, as I said, Jodie and I put together a handout with a lot of good information that we covered this afternoon or this morning. And my name is not on here, but I'd be happy to give it to you later. I'm Kelsey Hoeper, and this is Jodie Segal. Thank you.
Thanks so much, not just for the presentation, but what you're doing. As a long ago middle school and high school teacher, the thing that I found vexing when I did see things that worried me in kids was how hard it could be to get parents to hear answer our questions, frankly, or hear our ideas. And I'm just curious if you guys have any sort of thoughts about sort of how to have those conversations, how to help parents hear this when a school or outsider is noticing it, and also if you've seen any patterns about cultural, like differences in cultural norms, or whether it's religious or countries of origin or something, where those conversations just probably almost can't work.
Yeah, no, very good question. And then Kelsey, you join in after me, but you know, it's probably the most challenging part is not all the time. Sometimes, and many times, parents are extremely receptive and thankful when we talk to them and let them know what was found at the school and what's going on. But obviously, not all parents react in that way, and sometimes it's denial, you know, and saying, oh no, they just want attention, or they're just, yeah, they're fine. So we hear a lot of that. And sometimes, you know, I think a lot of it stems from fear that they are going to be viewed as being a bad parent, or scared that, oh my God, my child might really in fact be having these feelings. So sometimes that is the initial reaction. What we have seen is that in some cases where there's been students who have come up prior to this program and schools have been making active attempts to get students linked to services, sometimes it can be this program that's kind of that push. And so that's been something very positive. If not, then it's just something that schools need to keep working towards. And this is yet another example of hey, you know, something is in fact going on here. We need to do something. So we do the best we can. Obviously, if there is someone at imminent risk of suicide and schools feel they are in danger, it does not matter what parents say. There are ways to bypass that. We always try to get parents on board, and sometimes that involves calling administrators in to assist with these phone calls, or insisting that parents come to the school to have these conversations. And obviously, if parents are told that, look, you know, this is what we are seeing, we worry that this person's life is in danger, we want you to be the one to take them for this referral, and you know, they need to be evaluated at a behavioral health hospital. If you refuse as a parent, then this is what we as a school are going to do, and we are forced then to send them by ambulance, or to get the police involved, or DCFS involved, and no one wants that. So we try to work with parents in those emergency situations. The hardest time is when it's a non-emergency, you know, kind of those students who they just really need counseling. We really think they're depressed or have anxiety, or you know, they just really need support beyond what the school can give. And that's something that can't be forced. So in those cases, it's just documenting, you know, having those conversations, doing what can be done at the school level, and then continuing to at least try to work with parents you know, throughout the year. But that's a big challenge. In terms of the ethnic disparities, something that's come up a lot this year in particular has been really for our Asian and Indian populations. And we've had a number of students in certain districts where you know, we're seeing higher predominance of these populations, where we're hearing that parents, well, first of all, these kids, these teens are coming up in terms of the screener more readily because of a lot of parental pressures. And really, these kids are just hyper involved in sports and in activities and in school and in gifted programs and really high academic standards. And then perhaps they are getting a B or something minor. And that can be enough for parents to really come down on them. So we're seeing more of that, and along those lines, a resistance among some of these parents in terms of accepting that this could be depression or an illness. And so it's been a very, very big challenge, and what schools have really done is just try to think about other ways of talking to these parents. We don't want to put these parents on the spot or to get them defensive. The goal is to get students help. So instead of saying, you're the reason why your child is having all these thoughts, which you can't say, let's work together. We're really seeing a lot of our kids in these gifted programs with all these expectations, having some dealing with this in a difficult way, struggling to deal with this. And if we can work together, we're going to do this and this at school, and at home it would really help if you could do blank. But that is kind of where we're coming from, and we're actually working and trying to get more information on how to help deal with that, or help schools deal with that.
You mentioned one of the behaviors to look out for was writing about death and suicide. I have a certain sympathy for English teachers. I think some mass shooter was found later wrote a dark essay in his past. Love and death are the main themes of all literature. Should English professors have a certain training with this? Doesn't it depend on how they're approaching the topic?
That's a really great question. And actually, I had a student ask me almost that same exact question a couple of weeks ago at the school where James was at. And I'll kind of backtrack it. So when I'm at the middle school, mostly at the middle school setting, I get a lot of questions about well, my friends always say oh, my life is so hard, I wish I was dead. And fortunately, it's just become a part of our vernacular, especially with really young people. I'll be honest, when I was in high school, I kind of was a little irresponsible with the way that I talked about my hardships as well, right? But this is something that we're seeing with students all the time on social media as well. And so the questions that students are asking themselves is, how do I know if they're serious or not? And the best rule of thumb that we've given these students is that you literally just ask them. Hey, I've noticed, that you just said that you wish you were dead. I'm wondering if that's true. Is that true for you? Do you have thoughts about suicide often? And typically, that friend or that student's going to respond in one or two ways: is no, I'm good. I'm just kidding. I'm totally fine. Or it could be something along the lines of, actually things have been really tough at home, et cetera, et cetera. And when I'm in middle schools and high schools, I'm really encouraging students to be mindful of the language that they use, but to also not shy away from that question. Because it's a terrible feeling going home and asking yourself, should I have asked my friend? Should I have followed through on this? Should I have told somebody? So it's better to just ask right away. In terms of your question, and going back to the school that we were at a couple of weeks ago, I was in an English class. I was in an honors AP English class, and they were, I think reading Old Man and the Sea, right? And when it comes to literature, love and death and spirituality and et cetera, these are some of the most predominant themes that we have in literature, and that's not just obviously the United States. That's a universal thing. And so the way that I answered her question is I said, we're humans. We live and we die, and it is incredibly natural to think about death. Not in a morbid way, but we think about it, right? Every year we get a little bit older. It's something that's on our minds. Maybe more so when we're, in our 80s or our 90s, and less so when we're in our teen years. But it's really natural to think about death and dying. When I'm not working for Alyssa's mission, I work as a grief counselor. And people are always thinking about death and dying and how it relates to their stories and their loved ones. But the biggest difference is what I told this student is I asked her, how often is your friend talking about death or dying? How often does this come up in conversation, and what's the context? Are you talking about an English assignment, or is she talking about how horrible she feels going at home, how terrified she is to be with her dad, how overwhelmed she's feeling by the amount of homework? So we're looking at context a little bit as well. But I would say that when it comes to English papers, I always rule on the like trust your gut kind of a thing. If the assignment is about what are your thoughts on the circle of life and death, right? They're going to have probably some philosophical answers, but if you're reading and your student writes, I wish I was dead. I feel like I'm such a burden on others. I think that things would just be so much better for my family if I wasn't here. These are things that you want to be mindful of and be aware of. And I don't know, Jodie, if you wanted to add that to that at all.
You did a very thorough job, but just, with Alyssa, you heard in the video, her English paper, My Life Makes Me Want to Cry. That was something that Alyssa's mom saw only when she went to like an open house at the school and the papers were all posted up there. No one had told her or talked to her about that. And so that obviously was a very, very big mistake. I think that teachers now get a lot more training, especially English teachers, in terms of being on the lookout for some of these signs and when students are focusing on certain themes. And they are advised to bring it to the attention. Anything that worries them, bring to the attention of social workers, counselors, whoever it is in the building that can deal with these issues, because perhaps a certain student is identified through a paper and maybe there's something else that has happened with that student, and regardless, they could at least check in with them and ascertain, is this something they're just writing about through a paper? Are there other things going on with them? Because sometimes it is solely through writing that teens are communicating some of these feelings. And Alyssa was, that was a strength for her, something she loved to do, and it was also how she communicated a lot of her feelings of depression and suicide. So, sure.
City colleges don't even have counselors, Chicago, and I don't think the teachers get any training.
And I think they absolutely should. I mean, and we can only speak to what we're doing in middle and high schools, and what's required through a law in Illinois called Anne Marie's Law, which all teachers are supposed to be getting this kind of education. And we hope that schools are complying, and we're trying to just work with the schools that we have and keep growing to get this education out there to as many staff in schools as possible.
Hi, thank you so much. Great talk. I just got my master's degree in middle grade education. I really wish this was addressed more in my course. I did take several adolescent psychology courses. I think there's a paragraph or two or a chapter on suicide, teenage suicide. My question would be, when I was growing up, I had a friend tell me that they were thinking about committing suicide. I did, but the first scenario was, oh, I won't tell anybody. They did attempt it. I don't think it was really a serious one, but what is the impact of lying to them, saying, I won't tell anybody, and then telling someone? And then if you could speak on 13 reasons why, and if you feel it's really made light of teen suicide, or if it's actually just bringing up the topic and making people talk about it, and it's actually kind of a good thing.
In terms of, how students should respond in terms of if someone is possibly at risk. We talk about this in the classrooms all the time, and we talk about the fact that you might have a friend, and this is what Alyssa did, make their friends promise not to say anything. And then, they want to be a good friend, so what do they do in that situation? And we talk to them about the fact that, look, you have to think about what you can live with. If you are really worried about somebody to the extent you think they might hurt themselves, sometimes you have to break that promise, and it's okay to tell them that you're going to break that promise. But we know, too, that's a very difficult thing, or teens might be doing everything right by following that acknowledge, care, tell philosophy and trying to encourage their friend to tell and saying, I'll go with you, everything we want them to do, and then the friend says no, and you better not say anything. So options are, you could go on your own and tell a teacher, and that can be done, or tell a social worker, and that can be done anonymously. So we talk to teens about that and the ways that they can still tell without their friend necessarily knowing. That being said, sometimes it's very obvious who told, and they're still worried about that. But I think for the most part, at least in the classroom when we've had these conversations, every single time students are like, yes, you have to tell. You know, I would tell. It's better that they're mad. They're going to get over it. And we talk about that yes, they might be mad at first, but in fact, that's usually because they're scared. They think help might not be available, that people are going to be upset with them. And usually once they get the help that they need, they'll get over it once, you know, they're feeling better. In terms of that other point, you know, well, is it okay just to say, okay, I won't tell, and then tell? You know what, and sometimes that happens where students make that promise and then it's like, well, now what? And we absolutely say, yes, you can go back on that promise. Again, you might deal with a friend who's a little bit angry, but would you rather that scenario or a scenario where someone hurts themselves or worse? So it's not easy though, and I think it's something that teens definitely struggle with. 13 Reasons Why, I don't know if you want to.
I think that show premiered in 2016, if I'm not mistaken, and that's right around the time that I started working for the mission. And my initial reaction was, okay, this sounds interesting. I approached it with some skepticism, but I watched all of the seasons, one, because I knew students were going to have questions about it. And in both premiere dates, we got a handful of calls and emails, maybe more than a handful, from schools about, okay, how are we going to handle this? Because they know that students are going to find ways to watch it. It was one of like the most talked about shows of all time. And some of the suggestions that we gave to schools is to have an open conversation about the show. And that might even having it be like just in a group, in a classroom, or even pulling aside individuals that you know were recently impacted by suicide. There was a sudden death in the family. Maybe the student was recently hospitalized. And even inviting parents into that conversation as well, saying that if your student or your child is really adamant on watching, have a conversation with them prior about how it could be potentially triggering. We also recommended that if a student really wants to watch it, have a parent be right there in the room with them for the whole duration. I will say that in both seasons, the season finale of both the seasons was particularly triggering, especially even for me. It was incredibly hard to watch, and we recommend that students just avoid perhaps that last episode. But it really depends, again, on the age of the student, what their history is like, and on all that stuff. But I will say that I have my own personal opinions. Jodie can share hers. What 13 Reasons did is that it brought suicide into the limelight. People were talking about it. One of the drawbacks is that Google compiled the number of searches, and there were like thousands, millions of entries of how to commit suicide. How can I kill myself? And that's distressing. And especially in the first season, the adults in the show were portrayed as naive, that they were incredibly dismissive, that they saw these signs in their students, but they're like, they're fine. And that's not how we want, and that's what we don't want students to think, that if they go talk to the school counselor, that the school counselor is basically going to tell them it's going to be okay and to man up or whatever it may be. So that's one thing. And in my recollection, I don't think there was one mention of mental illness in the entire 2 seasons. And as Jodie just mentioned, mental illness is the leading risk factor for suicide, but there was no mention of treatment, how to access it. Only after parents and teachers had an uproar did they actually put a warning sign before each episode and gave the number for the suicide prevention hotline. I will say that the second season tried to make up for it, but still, we think that they could have handled it a little bit differently. And describing means and showing someone attempting suicide is incredibly triggering and incredibly harmful. So that's what I will say about that.
I mean, the good thing is, like Kelsey said, it brought it to the attention of parents and teachers, and We had several schools actually sign on because of this, because it was something talked about in their school, and they had parents in an uproar. And so we actually were able to get our programming into schools that previously were not as open towards it. We did several parent nights around the time when the first season was released, and that's probably the hardest thing we have getting into schools, that parent education night, because parents typically are not showing up. Schools don't want to take the time, and we understand, to organize a parent night when there's 3 parents who are going to come, and we have to think of that for our own purposes in terms of when we can go out to schools. But I had some very well-attended parent nights, and we also sent a lot of information out to schools in terms of how they could handle this information for staff as well as parents, and how they can talk to their kids about this program. So pros and cons, but yeah, I what Kelsey said, just the program itself, lots of damage, especially to vulnerable youth.
We're running out of time, but we need time for bagels. One last question, and then they'll get you during bagels.
We'll stay for bagels. People can come talk to us.
Thanks profusely for the work that you do, but don't you think that in a case like Alyssa, severe anxiety and consequent depression is largely genetic, as it certainly was in her case? And is there anything much that can be done about that? 'Cause that's the way the person is.
Yeah, that's a good question, and we are not medical professionals, so that's, I don't want to try and speak too much about that, but I do think, though, that even if someone has a certain risk factor, for example, a history or because of that genetic predisposition towards depression or suicide or other mental health disorders, it does not mean that that's what's going to happen. There's a lot of mitigating factors that can come into play. And we always talk about this when we're educating parents and when we're educating staff. So, for example, the teen's personality, if they have good social skills, if they're open to new ideas and new knowledge, they're talking to adults, they have good relationships with adults, that's something that can help reduce their risk, even if they have this diagnosis. On top of that, the relationships with parents are so important. Family connectedness is the #1 protective factor against suicide. So when teens feel that home is a safe, supportive environment, that no matter what they do, they're going to be accepted, even if things are awful at school and there's these other things that could be triggering, especially to someone who has anxiety or depression, that home is that kind of safe place. That goes a long way, and again, #1 protective factor in terms of reducing suicide attempts. Kelsey spoke about LGBTQ plus youth and that heightened risk when families are not accepting. So when families are accepting of teens, of all teens, regardless of what's going on with them, that is probably the #1 protective factor. And there's also things in the school as well. The more involved a student is in both activities, extracurriculars, clubs, inside of school, outside of school, when they have a solid peer group. So trying to encourage teens to get involved in things, that's something parents can do, that's something the school can do. Making sure they're not sitting off by themselves or spending every weekend on their computer alone in their room. So getting teens actively involved is really, really key. So those are some of those things that can help mitigate even if there is this diagnosis. It doesn't mean that because of it, it's a lost cause. And certainly all the treatment that's out there, positive treatments, medication, therapy, there's supplemental treatments, getting enough sleep, getting exercise, yoga, meditation, all those things. When that all kind of comes together, then that can really be preventative.